What is your vision for being the governor of Alaska?
Well, maybe the better question might be why run for governor of
I
Alaska?
suppose so.
Just because, the vision comes out of that reason for why you get in a race in the first place.
All right, so why do you want to run for governor? It's a tough job.
It is.
There's so many candid. I mean, they're coming out of the woodworks right now. There's a candidate coming up here, there, everywhere. There's so many
There's
of
like
them.
14 right now, and
It's
I suspect there'll be
ridiculous.
even more. It is kind of ridiculous in one sense, but by the same token, it shows a lot of interest by Alaskans in, wanting to actually do something. And so the question is, which one of those folks actually has a vision? And I think a number of us do, and then the voting populace gets a chance to, actually choose which one of us they want to have represented. For me, this is one of the toughest times in Alaska's history. And a reporter asked me not too long ago. It's like, why run now? This is like terrible time to run. I said, that's exactly when you run. You run when things are tough. I mean, I grew up here. I was born in Alaska. I lived, you're here in Mountain View and you're just South Mountain View, and I lived not too far from here,
Hmm.
and for me, what I've seen is my state become a state that really is stagnated.
Oh, absolutely agree.
You got to look at an economy that isn't moving forward. You look at school systems that have kind of ground down to a halt, and you look at all of that and you say, can't I do something about that? And I believe I can. When I was in the state senate, I could work across the aisle. I got things done. Even though I was in the minority, we got a lot of things done as a majority,
Hmm.
really sort of acting like a majority. And if you can do that while serving in the Senate, imagine what you might be able to do if you're governor. You know,
I can absolutely believe that running as a governor makes it more personal to the connection of Alaska rather than senator
Yeah, well,
being a
it
senator.
is more personal because you really do represent everyone. I mean, you're supposed to do that as well in the Senate, but when
Sure.
you're governor, you've got to go out to villages, you got to go into interior Alaska down to southeast. You got to know the state, and I've done that most of my adult life as a person who's worked in community. I've done that work in villages. I've slept on gym floors, and worked on most of the stuff I worked on was like substance use prevention, mental
Hmm.
health, working on education systems, and didn't run for office till I was much, much older and thought that was where I needed to go to get things done.
Well, I definitely appreciate that. What I can say is that the older you go, I mean, at least for me in my own experience, the older I became, the more knowledge I was able to accumulate and actually use to help other people.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's a really, at least in my own personal growth and journey, that's always been something that I was able to use for others, because
Well, wisdom comes with age. And you're representing that just now when you say that. It's like each year you learn more, and it's whether or not you apply that learning.
yeah, absolutely. When it comes to our current problems in Alaska, how do you find a way to solve those issues? What is your vision when it comes to trying to
Sure.
solve it?
Well, so first, let's talk about what those problems are because people talk about them. When I traveled through Southeast, I spent 2 weeks going to community after community. And, I went there talking about the need to improve our education system, which
Hmm.
I truly and deeply believe. We
Absolutely.
used to have one of the best in the country. We don't anymore. And there are good reasons for that. And they're solvable. The second thing is, the price of energy. For example, in rural Alaska, for a diesel gallon, you can pay as much as $16 a diesel gallon, and diesel's the primary fuel source. And we got to have ways to make gas and oil a little bit less expensive and energy less expensive for Alaskans.
Hmm.
And that came out, but housing came out, medical care, the fact that now people can't really afford to do medical care,
Hmm.
and it's taking young families and it's making them say, why would I live here if I can't even afford to raise my children here? And if I can't ensure they get a good education? So for me, all right, if this is our combination of problems, how do we solve that? Well, the first thing is we make sure that we have the revenue that the fair share of the revenue that we're supposed to have
Hmm.
from our resources. That's in our Constitution. But the second thing is we have to work across the aisle and stop this bickering and fighting that has underscored virtually every political fight. And those fights don't get us any closer to a solution.
Absolutely.
What I found is when I could sit down and talk with my colleagues that were Republicans in the state Senate, we could find common ground. And then you build a solution that isn't some kind of weak compromise, but a strong collaboration. And that's the kind of stuff that transforms the state. It makes it a place where people want to come.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. My one of my best friends terms what you exactly were talking about, arena politics. Right? It's either that you be with the Democrats or Republicans. You can't agree or disagree with each other, and that's what I've been noticing with a lot of our modern politics is always this arena politics that you're
Yeah,
not allowed to agree or
that's right.
with each other, otherwise you're playing for the wrong team. And I can say exactly what you are voicing is that that's not a democracy at the end of the day.
It's not.
It's not.
It's what it is it's a fight. It's a battle. It's not solution. It's not providing solutions. It's providing reasons to get one up on the other guy.
Yeah.
And that to me, there's no reason for any of us to do this if
No.
that's the end result, because you get nothing for the rest of the community, the rest of the state.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. And at the end of the day, the biggest losers are the people that are suffering with the bad legislation because individuals, the Senate is not able to agree with each other. There's no
Well,
terms of a middle ground.
Well, you might consider running someday because that's exactly the problem. I had one situation where there was a particular piece of legislation I was working on. People in my own party didn't want to do it because they said it would help the other guy.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, hold on. This is something we all believe in. Why
Hmm.
wouldn't you do the thing we all believe in? And that to me was always the frustrating thing. But
Yeah, absolutely.
I wouldn't trade away the friendships I made when I worked down there that were real. But there
Yeah.
were some that weren't real, and that's important to note too. That politics can be how do I want to say it?
A Game of Thrones.
An unforgiving game, I was going to say,
Right.
but it can be a Game of Thrones. I remember at the end of my last session in Juneau, which is back in, I finished in 2022,
Hmm.
technically January 23, but same deal. And this one friend of mine, a Republican, had been in the majority. He came up to me at the end of the session. He goes, so and such stabbed me in the back every time I turned around, but you never did. And
Yeah.
even though he expected me to, and that's what I said to him back at him, but you never did to me either. I said, what you did is you carried on a dialogue with me.
Hmm.
And that dialogue allowed us to build a piece of legislation that was transformational because both you and I could agree on it, which means we could take away the fear factor,
Hmm.
build the legislation back. That was a good thing.
I can see that Socrates was very important to you.
Well, it's true. It's
Yeah.
absolutely true.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree. Is that once we start focusing on the the states rather than internal politics within each other, actually good could come out of it. And I really appreciate that dialogue that you're mentioning there because that's what I think America needs to hear right now is that it doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. If you're able to work together and have some bipartisan bills come out,
That's right.
there's
That's where success comes
that's
from.
where success comes from. And that's what I want to believe that's what the founding fathers actually wanted to begin with.
I use it in terms of even local politics. I was at a little town called Gustavus, which is near Juneau, and I flew in there. It's about 680 people, and I was taken to what they called a MAGA breakfast, and they're like, "Well, do you want to go?" So of course I want to go. I like to talk to people.
Yeah.
So we had this conversation. It was the leader of that group and a pastor and some other folks, and
Hmm.
and toward the end of the dialogue, he said, "Well, what's your position on the Democratic Party platform?" And I said, I'm going to be frank with you. I haven't actually read it. What I'm here doing is talking with you."
Yeah.
And we've all been talking about that road out there. And we've been talking about this dirt road that they had, which they couldn't get the Department of Transportation to plow.
Hmm.
I said, you want that pothole filled. That pothole isn't a Democrat. That pothole isn't a Republican or nonpartisan.
It's just a
It's a
pothole.
pothole.
It's a pothole.
It's a pothole.
Yeah.
And we all want it filled. And they burst out laughing and they said, you're right. We all want it filled. I said, look,
Look, I'll
that's what
get the
this is
dirt and
about.
start scooping it in there if you
Let's
wanted
do it.
to.
We can do this together.
Right.
And that kind of dialogue is what I think will transform Alaska back in a way, going back to the Alaska I grew up in, where people didn't care about your ideology. What they cared about was whether you cared about each other
Yeah.
and worked with each other. And that is my belief. And
Hmm.
I've never found a problem you couldn't solve if people actually wanted to solve it. But you got to be willing to listen to them,
Yeah.
you know.
And I
So,
hear you
yeah,
there.
that's important to me.